December 19, 1944. The snow-covered forests of Belgium whispered with an eerie silence, broken only by the distant rumble of advancing armor. Along a frozen ridge near the town of Bastogne, a lone gunner adjusted his sights, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold that cut through even the thickest winter gear. Temperatures had dropped to 15 degrees below freezing, and the wind carried with it the promise of more snow, more misery, more death. He had been told 6 times he wasn't good enough, wasn't the right fit, wasn't what the army needed. 6 times, recruiting sergeants had looked at his paperwork, looked at his face and found reasons to send him away. Yet here he stood, frozen fingers wrapped around the grips of an 84-pound machine gun, about to prove that courage recognizes no color and that determination can shatter steel itself. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the next 72 hours would transform a man the military had repeatedly rejected into a legend whose actions would echo through history, proving that true valor cannot be denied and that excellence, when demonstrated with such undeniable force, must eventually be recognized. His name was Warren George Harding Creasy, and his journey to that frozen Belgian ridge had been anything but ordinary. It was a path marked by rejection, perseverance, and an unshakable belief that he had something to offer his country, even when his country seemed determined not to accept it. Born in 1919 in the sprawling city of Los Angeles, California, Warren grew up in a world that told him daily, through 1,000 small cruelties and large injustices, where he belonged and where he didn't. His parents, hard-working people who had migrated from Louisiana seeking better opportunities in the West, raised him with 2 unwavering principles that would define his entire life. Work harder than anyone else has to work, and never, under any circumstances, let anyone else define your worth. His father, a railway porter named George Creasy, would return home each evening with stories of the places he'd seen through train windows, worlds that seemed impossibly distant to young Warren, filled with possibilities that felt forever out of reach. George Creasy worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, serving passengers who rarely looked him in the eye, carrying bags for tips that barely sustained the family. But he never complained, never showed bitterness, never let the daily indignities break his spirit. Instead, he came home and told Warren about the mountains he'd seen that day, the cities rushing past the windows, the vast country that existed beyond their small neighborhood. "This country is bigger than the people who try to make it small," George would say, sitting at their modest dinner table. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Warren's mother, Sarah, worked as a seamstress, her fingers perpetually pricked from needles, her eyes strained from hours of close work in poor light. She made dresses for wealthy women who shopped on Wilshire Boulevard, women who would cross the street rather than walk past Warren on the sidewalk. Yet Sarah never spoke ill of anyone. She simply worked, saved what little she could, and taught Warren that dignity came from within, not from how others treated you. "You can't control what people think," she told him when he came home angry from school, furious at some slight or another. "But you can control what you do. You can control how hard you work, how much you learn, how ready you are when opportunity comes." By 1941, when the conflict in Europe had already consumed countless lives and entire nations had fallen under occupation, Warren stood at the recruitment office in downtown Los Angeles for the first time. He was 22 years old, standing 6 feet tall, strong from years of warehouse work loading and unloading freight trucks, and filled with a burning desire to serve his country. He had followed the news from Europe with growing alarm. France had fallen. Britain stood alone against continuous assault. The stories of resistance fighters, of brave soldiers holding impossible positions, of ordinary people rising to meet extraordinary challenges, all of it resonated with something deep inside Warren. The recruitment office was located on 5th Street, in a building that smelled of floor wax and old paper. Posters covered the walls, showing determined soldiers, sailors, and airmen, all urging young men to do their duty. "Your country needs you," one proclaimed in bold letters. "Join the fight for freedom," declared another. Warren stood in line for 40 minutes, watching other young men sign their papers, shake hands with recruiters, and walk out with the pride of accepted volunteers. When his turn finally came, the recruiting sergeant, a weathered man with greying temples and campaign ribbons from the previous world conflict on his chest, looked up from his paperwork with barely concealed disdain. His eyes travelled from Warren's face down to his hands and back up again, a journey that took perhaps 3 seconds, but communicated volumes. "We're not taking your kind right now," the sergeant said flatly. Not even bothering to review Warren's information, not asking about his education or work history or physical fitness. "Come back another time." Warren felt heat rise in his face. "Sir, I'm qualified, I'm healthy, I'm strong, I can—" "I said come back another time," the sergeant interrupted, already looking past Warren to the next person in line, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. Warren returned 2 weeks later, hoping for a different sergeant, a different result. A different sergeant sat at the desk, younger, with fewer ribbons and more nervous energy. But the response was identical. The rejection stung, not because it was unexpected. Warren had grown up with rejection as a constant companion, but because it was so casual, so matter-of-fact, as if his willingness to risk everything meant nothing at all, as if his desire to serve, to contribute, to stand up for the principles his country claimed to represent, all of that was simply irrelevant. Third attempt, March 1942. By now, the conflict had spread across the entire globe. The attack on Pearl Harbor had brought the nation directly into the war. Recruitment offices were overwhelmed with volunteers. The military was expanding at an unprecedented rate. Training camps springing up across the country. Production facilities running 3 shifts to produce weapons and equipment. Yet the answer for Warren remained the same. Warren's friend, Marcus Williams, who had accompanied him on that third attempt, pulled him away as Warren's fists clenched at his sides. Pulled him out of the office before anger could lead to something that would give them a real reason to reject him permanently. "They're not worth it, Warren," Marcus whispered urgently, steering him down the street, away from the recruitment office. "Don't give them a reason. Don't give them what they want." But Warren couldn't let it go. The injustice of it gnawed at him. Here was his country, facing an existential threat, needing every able-bodied soldier it could find, yet turning him away for reasons that had nothing to do with his capability. He watched newsreels at the movie theater showing the expanding conflict, saw reports of units being overwhelmed for lack of reinforcements, heard politicians giving speeches about national unity and shared sacrifice. The hypocrisy was almost unbearable. Fourth attempt, May 1942. Fifth attempt, August 1942. Each time, a different excuse. Quota filled, wrong paperwork, not currently processing applications from your area. Processing delayed for administrative review. The reasons varied, but the underlying message remained constant, as clear as if they had simply said it outright. "We don't want you." Between the fourth and fifth attempts, Warren took a job at the Douglas Aircraft Plant in Long Beach, one of the massive facilities producing bombers for the war effort. The work was hard, 12-hour shifts assembling components for aircraft that would fly over Europe and the Pacific. He worked alongside men and women of all backgrounds, everyone focused on the same goal of producing the weapons needed to win the war. The foreman, a gruff man named Jim Patterson, who judged workers solely on their output, promoted Warren to team lead after just 3 months. "You're the best worker I've got," Patterson told him, offering a small raise. "You show up on time, you don't complain, and you get more done in a shift than most people get done in 2. I need more like you." Warren appreciated the words, appreciated the work, but it felt hollow. He was building bombers that other men would fly. He was contributing to the war effort from thousands of miles away. It wasn't enough. He needed to be there, needed to face the same risks, needed to prove himself in the way that mattered most. The 6th rejection came in November 1942, and this time, something inside Warren shifted. The recruiting officer, a lieutenant with fresh academy polish still on his shoes and a West Point ring on his finger, didn't even look Warren in the eye as he delivered the news. He shuffled papers, made notations, and spoke in a monotone that suggested he had delivered this same message dozens of times before. "Application denied. Administrative reasons. You can reapply in 6 months if circumstances change." Warren stood there for a long moment, staring at the recruitment posters on the wall. "Your country needs you," one proclaimed, showing a determined soldier charging forward, rifle in hand, face set with resolve. Another showed Uncle Sam pointing directly at the viewer, the famous "I want you" message that had motivated millions to enlist. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Warren. His country apparently wanted him, just not in uniform, not where it really counted. He walked out into the cool November evening, the streetlights of Los Angeles beginning to flicker on as darkness fell. The city continued its normal rhythms, people heading home from work, cars moving through intersections, life proceeding as if the world wasn't burning itself apart on the other side of two oceans. He could have given up. Many did, accepting the rejection as final, as an unchangeable verdict on their worth. But Warren's father had taught him something crucial, something that had been reinforced through countless small battles and daily struggles. The world will try to break you down, will try to convince you that you're less than you are, but you only truly lose when you let it, when you accept their judgment as truth. In January 1943, everything changed. The military, facing mounting losses across multiple theaters of operation and an expanding scope of conflict, began opening more positions to soldiers of all backgrounds. The official policy shifted, partly from necessity, partly from pressure from civil rights organizations, partly from the simple mathematics of war that required warm bodies to fill uniforms. When Warren walked into that recruitment office for the 7th time, he carried with him a determination forged in 6 rejections, tempered by months of watching others go off to fight while he was left behind. This time, the sergeant behind the desk was different, not in appearance but in attitude. He actually looked at Warren's application, actually reviewed his work history and education, actually asked about his physical fitness and prior experience with weapons. "You've applied 6 times before," the sergeant noted, flipping through a file. "That's persistent." "I want to serve, sir," Warren said simply. "I've wanted to serve since 1941. I'm ready to do whatever needs doing." The sergeant studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Report to the induction center on Monday. Bring these forms already filled out. Welcome to the United States Army." Just like that, after 6 rejections spanning nearly 2 years, Warren was in. The relief was overwhelming, almost dizzying. He had proven something already, had demonstrated that persistence could overcome systematic rejection. But the real proving was yet to come. Camp Walters, Texas, spring 1943. The training was brutal, designed to break men down physically and mentally, then rebuild them as soldiers capable of functioning in the chaos of combat. For Warren, every obstacle course, every forced march with full pack, every drill sergeant's screaming command carried extra weight. He wasn't just proving himself to the Army now. He was proving himself to everyone who had turned him away, to every recruiting sergeant who had dismissed him with barely a glance, to every person who had ever suggested he wasn't good enough. The camp sprawled across thousands of acres of Texas scrubland, housing tens of thousands of recruits in hastily constructed barracks. The day started before dawn and ended long after dark. Physical training, weapons drill, tactical instruction, field exercises, all of it designed to transform civilians into soldiers. The washout rate was high. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion during summer marches. Others couldn't handle the mental pressure, the constant demands, the absolute requirement for instant obedience and precision. Warren watched men twice his size fail where he succeeded, watched supposedly superior specimens crack under pressure that he bore without complaint. His bunkmate, a farm boy from Iowa named Thomas Fitzgerald, watched Warren during those first brutal weeks with curious fascination. Fitzgerald came from a family that had farmed the same land for 3 generations. He was strong from years of manual labor, used to hard work and long hours, but even he struggled with the relentless pace of training. Where other recruits collapsed after 15-mile forced marches, Warren kept his back straight, his pace steady, his rifle properly positioned. Where others fumbled with weapons assembly during timed drills, Warren's hands moved with practiced precision, each motion economical and exact. "You act like you've got something to prove," Fitzgerald observed one evening, as they cleaned their rifles in the barracks, every weapon requiring meticulous maintenance that would be inspected with exacting standards. Warren didn't look up from his work, carefully running a cleaning rod down the barrel, checking for any residue that might cause malfunction. Everyone's got something to prove out here. Yeah, but you, Fitzgerald persisted, watching how Warren's hands never stopped moving, how even during conversation his focus remained on the task. You're different. You move like every single thing you do matters more, like you're trying to be perfect, not just good enough. Warren finally met his eyes, considering how much to share. That's because it does matter more. I had to fight just to get here. I'm not about to waste the opportunity. The training covered everything from small arms to tactical movement, from radio operation to field medicine. But Warren found himself drawn to the heavy weapons division with almost magnetic pull. There was something about the massive guns, the sheer weight of them, the precision required to operate them effectively under combat conditions. That spoke to him. When the instructors demonstrated the M2 Browning heavy machine gun, Warren studied every detail with intense focus, committing to memory every component, every function, every potential failure point. The M2 was a formidable weapon, the result of decades of refinement. It was designed by John Moses Browning before his death, and refined by others into the weapon that would serve through countless conflicts. It weighed 84 pounds when mounted, could fire between 450 and 600 rounds per minute depending on configuration, and had an effective range against infantry targets of nearly 2,000 yards. The barrel was 45 inches long, the weapon fed from disintegrating link belts, and it required regular barrel changes during sustained fire to prevent overheating that could warp the steel and ruin accuracy. But what fascinated Warren most was its potential as an anti-armor weapon when loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The standard ball ammunition could penetrate light cover and suppress infantry, but the armor-piercing rounds could punch through up to 3/4 of an inch of steel plate at close range. Tank armor was thicker than that, certainly, but armor wasn't uniform. There were weak points, joints where plates met, engine decks with thinner protection, vision ports that needed to be thinner to allow sight lines. In theory, if someone understood exactly where those weak points were and could place rounds with absolute precision, the M2 could become something it was never designed to be: a tank killer. Sergeant William Mackenzie, a veteran of earlier campaigns in North Africa, who had seen more combat than most of the training cadre combined, noticed Warren's interest during a weapons demonstration. Mackenzie was a rarity in the army of that era, a man who judged soldiers solely by their capability, who didn't care about background or color or anything except whether a man could do the job. He pulled Warren aside after one training session, after Warren had disassembled and reassembled the M2 in record time during a timed drill. "I've got an eye for this weapon," Mackenzie said, gesturing to the heavy gun sitting on its mount. "But having an eye and having the skill to use it in combat are two very different things. This weapon will punish mistakes. It'll jam if you don't maintain it perfectly, if you let dirt get into the mechanism, if the headspace and timing aren't set exactly right. It'll fail you in the moment you need it most if you don't respect what it can and can't do." "Then I'll respect it, Sergeant," Warren replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "I'll learn everything about it. I'll maintain it better than anyone. I'll make sure it never fails." Mackenzie studied him for a long moment, seeing something in Warren's eyes that convinced him this wasn't empty bravado. "I believe you will. You're assigned to my weapons squad when we form up the combat unit. Don't make me regret it." Over the following months, as training progressed from individual skills to squad tactics to company-level exercises, Warren became intimately familiar with every component of the M2. He could disassemble and reassemble it blindfolded, his hands learning the feel of each part, the exact pressure needed to manipulate each component. He knew the sound it made when it was about to jam, a slight hesitation in the cycling action that most gunners would never notice. He knew the subtle vibration that indicated a worn firing pin that needed replacement. He understood the exact tension needed on the belt feed mechanism to ensure smooth ammunition flow without causing excessive friction that could slow the rate of fire. He practiced until his shoulders were one massive bruise from the recoil, until the skin on his hands cracked from the constant exposure to gun oil and cleaning solvents, until his arms shook from holding the weapon steady during long training sessions. He studied ballistics manuals in what little free time the training schedule allowed, learning about trajectory and wind drift, and how temperature affected powder burn rate. He memorized the armor specifications of every enemy vehicle he might encounter, learning where their weak points were, where side armor was thinnest, where top armor could be penetrated with the right angle of attack. The other soldiers in his training company began to notice. During live fire exercises, Warren's accuracy was uncanny. During field problems, his weapon never jammed while others struggled with malfunctions. During inspections, his M2 was always immaculate, every component perfectly maintained, every specification exactly to standard. Fitzgerald, who had been assigned as an assistant gunner and radio operator, working in direct support of Warren's position, watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. "You know, most guys treat training as something to get through," Fitzgerald commented one evening as they prepared equipment for the next day's exercise. "You treat it like it's the most important thing in the world." "It is the most important thing," Warren replied, checking the headspace on his weapon for the third time, ensuring the measurement was exactly right. "When we get into actual combat, there won't be do-overs. There won't be second chances because I didn't practice enough. Every mistake here is a mistake I won't make over there, where mistakes get people sent home in boxes." By December 1943, Warren's unit received orders to deploy to Europe. The 764th Tank Destroyer Battalion had completed its training cycle and was being shipped overseas to join the fighting. They shipped out from New York Harbor on a freezing January morning in 1944, part of a massive convoy crossing the Atlantic, dozens of ships moving in formation, protected by destroyer escorts watching for enemy submarines that prowled the shipping lanes. The crossing took 2 weeks of misery. The troopship was crowded, thousands of soldiers packed into spaces designed for half that number. The food was terrible, the seas rough, and nearly everyone spent at least some time leaning over the rail feeding the fish. Warren stood on deck whenever possible, watching the grey waves roll past, thinking about what lay ahead. Somewhere beyond that eastern horizon was a continent in flames, millions of people locked in a struggle that would determine the shape of the world for generations. Soon, he would be part of that struggle, would finally have the chance to prove that the 6 rejections had been wrong, that he had something valuable to contribute. England, February 1944. The unit stationed near Southampton, joining thousands of other soldiers gathering for what everyone knew was coming. The massive invasion that would open a new front and carry the war into occupied territory. The English winter was different from Texas, wetter and colder in a way that seemed to penetrate to the bones. They trained in conditions that approximated what they would face on the continent, learning to maintain weapons in constant dampness, learning to move through hedgerow country, learning to coordinate with armor and infantry in combined arms operations. Warren's squad integrated into the 764th Tank Destroyer Battalion, a unit that would see some of the most intense action of the European campaign. The battalion's primary mission was clear: stop enemy armor. They were equipped with M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, fast and lightly armored vehicles mounting 76mm guns capable of penetrating most enemy tanks at combat ranges. The Hellcats were built for speed and firepower, trading heavy armor for mobility. They could race to threatened sectors, engage enemy armor from favorable positions, then relocate before counterfire could destroy them. But Warren's position was different from the Hellcats' main gunners. As a heavy weapons specialist, he manned the M2 machine gun mounted on his assigned vehicle, a weapon primarily intended for anti-aircraft defense and infantry suppression. In the tactical doctrine of the time, the M2 on a tank destroyer had 2 jobs: keep enemy infantry away from the vehicle and engage any aircraft that might attack from above. Nobody expected it to become a tank killer. Nobody had trained Warren to use it that way. But Warren had studied those armor specifications, had memorized those weak points, and had an idea forming in the back of his mind about what might be possible. The invasion came on June 6, 1944. The massive Allied assault on the beaches of Normandy, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, all crashing against the German fortifications in a gamble to establish a foothold on the continent. Warren's unit didn't land on D-Day itself, but followed in the subsequent waves, arriving on the beaches of Normandy in mid-June, when the immediate fighting had moved inland, but the devastation of the initial assault still littered the sand. The scene was incomprehensible to someone seeing large-scale combat for the first time. Wrecked vehicles sat where they had been hit, some partially submerged in the surf, others burned to blackened hulks. The smell of smoke and death hung in the air despite the ocean breeze. Soldiers moved supplies from ships to shore in endless chains of activity, building the logistical base that would support the advance into France. The constant sound of artillery fire inland created a backdrop of thunder that never quite stopped, a reminder that just a few miles away, men were fighting and dying. Warren's first real engagement came near the town of Saint-Lô in early July. The hedgerow country of Normandy created perfect defensive terrain, each field bordered by thick earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, creating natural fortifications that turned every advance into a small-scale assault. Enemy infantry had entrenched in one such hedgerow, setting up machine gun positions that commanded the approaches, and Warren's vehicle moved up to provide fire support for an infantry attack. The first time Warren fired the M2 in actual combat, the recoil surprised him, despite all his training. The controlled environment of a training range couldn't fully replicate the adrenaline, the fear, the knowledge that people were trying very hard to kill him. His first burst was high, rounds cracking through the air above the enemy position, but his hands remembered their practice, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought struggled, adjusting elevation, correcting traverse, and the weapon sang its deadly song. The heavy rounds chewed through the vegetation and the earthen bank, suppressing the enemy position, allowing the infantry to advance. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes but felt like hours, time compressing and expanding in the strange way combat does. When they finally withdrew to regroup, the enemy position silent, Warren's hands shook as he cleaned the gun, checking for any damage, any signs of malfunction. Fitzgerald, manning the radio in the same vehicle, noticed the tremor. "First time's always the hardest," Fitzgerald offered, his own voice not entirely steady. He had spent the engagement calling in coordinates and updates, watching the battle unfold, but not directly participating in the same way. Warren nodded, not trusting his voice, not yet ready to process what he had just experienced. But something had changed in those minutes of combat. The theoretical had become real. The mechanical had become visceral. The training had translated into survival, both his own and the infantrymen whose advance he had supported. He had done what was necessary, and he could do it again. He would have to do it again many times before this was over. Through the summer and fall of 1944, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and pushed across France, Warren's battalion fought in dozens of engagements. They supported advances, covered withdrawals, engaged enemy armor trying to establish defensive lines. Warren's reputation within the battalion grew steadily. He was reliable when reliability meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. He was precise when precision saved ammunition and lives. He was absolutely fearless under fire, not because he didn't feel fear, everyone felt fear, but because he refused to let it control his actions. Other crews began requesting him when forming assault teams or setting up defensive positions. Officers noticed how his presence seemed to steady younger soldiers, how his calm competence under pressure provided an example that helped others find their own courage. By the time winter approached, Warren had become one of the most respected soldiers in the entire battalion, a man whose judgment could be trusted and whose skills had been proven repeatedly. But it was in December 1944, in the frozen forests of Belgium, during what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, that Warren Cressy would write his name into legend with actions that defied everything conventional military wisdom said was possible. The German military launched their final major offensive in the West on December 16, 1944. Nearly 500,000 troops, thousands of armored vehicles supported by what remained of the Air Force, all crashing through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. The strategic goal was ambitious: split the Allied forces in half, drive through to the vital port of Antwerp, capture the massive supply depots that fed the Allied advance, and force a negotiated peace before the economic and industrial superiority of the Allies could grind down the last German resistance. The offensive achieved complete surprise. American units, many of them resting after hard fighting or newly arrived and inexperienced, found themselves facing veteran assault troops supported by heavy armor. Entire regiments were overrun or forced to retreat in disorder. Communication lines were cut, command structures disrupted, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that the offensive might actually succeed in splitting the Allied front. Warren's battalion, the 764th Tank Destroyer Battalion, found itself directly in the path of this assault. Orders came down to hold critical road junctions around the town of Bastogne, a key logistics hub that controlled access to the road network throughout the region. If Bastogne fell, enemy forces could move freely through the American rear areas. If it held, the German advance would be channeled into narrower corridors where it could be contained and eventually destroyed. The 764th was tasked with establishing positions on the approaches to Bastogne, using the mobility of their Hellcats to move between threatened sectors, engaging enemy armor before it could reach the town itself. The battalion was spread thin, each company responsible for covering far more ground than tactical doctrine recommended, but there were no reserves available. No reinforcements coming. They would hold with what they had, or they would fall, and with them would fall any chance of containing the offensive. The first major attack on Warren's sector came at dawn on December 19th, the day after his unit had established positions on a ridge overlooking a critical crossroads. Warren was manning his position on the M2, having just finished a night of fitful sleep in temperatures that had dropped to 15 degrees below freezing. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, his fingers were numb despite heavy gloves, and frost coated every metal surface of the weapon. The trees to the east seemed to come alive with movement as the sun began to rise, long shadows making it difficult to distinguish between wind-blown snow and advancing troops. Then Warren saw them clearly, the distinctive shapes of Panzer Mark IV medium tanks, their engines rumbling as they advanced in formation through the forest. These were not the crude early war models, but the improved variants with upgraded armor and more powerful guns, dangerous opponents for even the Hellcat's 76mm weapon. His vehicle commander, Lieutenant Richard Anderson, came from a wealthy Boston family, had attended prestigious schools, and had initially been skeptical of Warren's assignment to his crew. 3 months of combat had erased those doubts completely. Anderson had seen Warren's performance under fire, had watched him maintain his weapon and his composure through engagements that left other soldiers shaking, and had come to trust Warren's judgment implicitly. "Cressy," Anderson's voice came through the intercom, tight and controlled. "We've got multiple armor contacts advancing from the east. Looks like at least 6 tanks, possibly more behind them. Main gun engaging lead elements. Keep that 50 ready for infantry support when they show themselves." The Hellcat's main gun boomed, the entire vehicle rocking with the recoil, and Warren watched the lead tank shudder as the round struck home. But it didn't penetrate. The range was too great for a killing shot, and the enemy tank continued advancing, beginning to return fire with its own main gun. The second Hellcat in their position fired, then the third, and now the dawn filled with the thunder of tank guns trading shots at long range. Then something unexpected happened, the kind of battlefield accident that creates opportunities for those ready to exploit them. One of the advancing tanks, its commander perhaps overconfident or simply inexperienced, exposed its thinner side armor as it maneuvered around a destroyed vehicle from an earlier engagement. The tank side was presented to Warren's position at an angle, and in that moment, Warren's months of study crystallized into action. The M2 wasn't designed as an anti-tank weapon. Every tactical manual said so. Every training instructor had emphasized that heavy machine guns were for infantry and soft targets, but Warren had studied armor specifications with obsessive detail. He knew that the side armor on a Panzer Mark IV was 50mm thick, hardened steel that should easily stop machine gun fire. He also knew that armor-piercing incendiary rounds from an M2 could penetrate 3/4 of an inch of steel plate at close range, and 3/4 of an inch was roughly 19mm. Simple mathematics suggested it was impossible, but Warren also knew that armor wasn't uniform. The joints where side armor met the engine compartment were weaker. The access panels for maintenance had to be thinner. The ventilation grills couldn't be as heavily protected, and at the right angle, with the right ammunition targeting the right spot, physics cared nothing for what was supposed to be impossible. Warren swung the heavy gun around, leading the target, accounting for its movement through the snow. His first burst was exploratory, feeling out the range and the target's speed. Rounds stitched across the tank's side, most glancing off the armored plates with showers of sparks, but Warren was watching, learning where the weak points were. His second burst focused on the engine deck area, where thinner top armor met the vertical side plates. 3 rounds found the junction point, punched through the compromised armor, and suddenly thick black smoke began pouring from the tank's engine compartment. The tank slewed to a halt, its engine damaged or destroyed, and the crew began evacuating, scrambling out of hatches as smoke filled the interior. Warren had just disabled a medium tank with a heavy machine gun, something that wasn't supposed to be possible, something that would make any tactical instructor shake their head in disbelief. "Did you just take out a tank with the 50? Fitzgerald's voice over the intercom carried pure astonishment. "Weak points," Warren replied, already scanning for the next target, his mind cataloguing what he had learned, where the rounds had penetrated, what angles had worked. Everything has weak points if you know where to look. The engagement continued for 3 hours, a running battle as enemy armor tried to force the American position and the defenders fought to hold the critical crossroads. Warren's Hellcat destroyed 2 more tanks with its main gun, the 76mm weapon doing exactly what it was designed to do. But Warren himself accounted for 2 more enemy vehicles with the M2, both times finding the vulnerable spots where armor was thinnest, where rounds could penetrate if the angle was perfect and the aim was true. When they finally withdrew to resupply and rearm, falling back to a secondary position while another unit moved up to take their place, Anderson approached Warren with an expression that mixed exhaustion and amazement. "Cressy," Anderson said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands, "in all my training at the academy, in all the tactical manuals I've read, in everything I learned about combined arms warfare, nobody ever mentioned using a 50 cal as an anti-tank weapon. That's not a thing that's supposed to work." Warren was exhausted beyond anything he had experienced before. His shoulders were one massive bruise from hours of recoil pounding into them. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that would last for days. His hands were stiff and cold, despite the heavy gloves. But he had proven something important, not just to Anderson but to himself. "Guess nobody told the tanks they weren't supposed to be vulnerable to it, sir," Warren said, allowing himself a small smile despite the exhaustion. But that first major engagement was only the beginning. Over the next 72 hours, as the German offensive pushed deeper into American lines, and the situation around Bastogne became increasingly desperate, Warren's battalion fought a series of delaying actions that would test every soldier to their absolute limits. They would set up at a crossroads or ridgeline, engage the advancing armor with everything they had, inflict maximum casualties, then fall back to the next defensive position before they could be overwhelmed and surrounded. It was textbook defensive doctrine, trading space for time, making the enemy pay for every mile gained. Each position, each engagement, Warren's M2 roared into action, and each time he found new ways to make the impossible routine. December 20th, a defensive position near the small village of Chaumont. The morning fog was so thick that visibility dropped to less than 100 yards, the kind of weather that should favor the attackers by negating the defenders' range advantage. 6 enemy tanks approached through the fog, their commanders confident that the poor visibility would protect them from long-range anti-tank fire, allowing them to close to point-blank range before the defenders could effectively engage. But Warren didn't need long range. He didn't need clear visibility beyond a certain distance. He waited, patient despite the tension, despite knowing that enemy tanks were somewhere out there in the fog, getting closer with every second. Then they emerged from the mist, massive shapes materializing like ghosts, and Warren went to work. The first tank, a Panzer Mark IV identical to ones he had engaged the previous day, exposed its engine deck as it climbed a slight rise in the terrain, the commander trying to get a better view of the American positions. Warren's rounds, carefully aimed at the thin top armor protecting the engine compartment, punched through and found something vital. Smoke billowed from the vehicle, thick and black, and it ground to a halt within seconds. The second tank, alerted by the destruction of its companion and trying to maneuver around the disabled vehicle, turned its side to Warren's position. More rounds, more precisely aimed bursts at the weak points he had identified, more smoke, another vehicle out of action. The crews were good, They reacted quickly, laying smoke and trying to back out of the killing zone, but Warren had learned their tactics now, knew how they would respond, and he was ready. By the time the fog began to lift an hour later, 4 enemy tanks sat disabled or destroyed on the approach to the village, and the remaining 2 had withdrawn. Somewhere back at enemy headquarters, commanders were receiving reports of heavy resistance, of positions that should have fallen quickly holding against their assault, and those commanders were being forced to commit more resources to sectors they had expected to overrun with minimal opposition. December 21st, an abandoned farmhouse outside Bastogne that had been converted into a strong point. The building itself was barely standing, walls pockmarked with bullet holes from previous fighting, windows long since shattered, roof partially collapsed. But it sat on a small rise that commanded the approach road, and Warren's vehicle formed part of a defensive line that was desperately thin, spread across far too much ground with far too few soldiers. When enemy armor appeared in the early afternoon, 4 tanks advancing with at least 2 companies of infantry in support, Anderson made a quick tactical calculation. Their main gun could probably destroy 1 tank, maybe 2 if they were lucky and quick, before the others identified their position and concentrated fire that would overwhelm the lightly armored Hellcat. Against 4 tanks with infantry support, conventional tactics suggested withdrawal before being outflanked and destroyed. "Creasy," Anderson said quietly, watching the approaching enemy through his vision blocks. "I hope you've got more miracles in you." Warren was already sighting on the lead tank, his hands steady, despite the knowledge that this was going to be close, brutal, and potentially final. "Not miracles, sir, just physics and weak points, same as always." The engagement that followed would be discussed in after-action reports with the kind of clinical language that failed to capture its desperate intensity. Warren's first target, the lead tank, went down with rounds through its track assembly, dozens of heavy bullets chewing through the relatively thin metal until something broke and the track separated, immobilizing the vehicle. The crew, trained and competent, immediately began trying to repair the damage, soldiers emerging with tools to attempt field repairs. The second tank took main gunfire from the Hellcat and exploded spectacularly, its ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions that sent the turret flying. But now the remaining 2 tanks had identified the threat and were maneuvering to flank the farmhouse, trying to get angles that would allow them to destroy the Hellcat while minimizing their own exposure. The third tank, its commander now fully aware of the threat posed by Warren's heavy machine gun, tried to present its frontal armor to Warren's position, the thickest part of the vehicle that should be immune to anything short of a main tank gun. But frontal armor had weak points too. Warren had studied them all. The driver's vision port, a vulnerability that allowed the driver to see but required thinner armor. The bow machine gun mount, another weak point where the armor had to be compromised. The spots where armor plates joined and welds could fail under sustained fire. Warren found them all, patient despite the rounds impacting around his position, despite the very real possibility that the next enemy shot would punch through the Hellcat's thin armor and end everything. 15 minutes of sustained fire, of careful aim and controlled bursts, of making every round count because ammunition was finite and mistakes were fatal. 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours. Time stretching in the way it does when death is close and every second might be the last. When the smoke finally cleared and the surviving enemy forces withdrew, 4 enemy tanks sat disabled or destroyed around the farmhouse, and Warren had personally accounted for 3 of them with the M2. The Hellcat had taken multiple hits, none penetrating but all leaving scars on the armor, testament to how close the engagement had been. The stories began spreading through the battalion like wildfire. The gunner who could kill tanks with a machine gun, the soldier who had been rejected 6 times and was now single-handedly holding off armored assaults that should have overwhelmed entire platoons. In the midst of one of the most desperate battles of the entire war, as the situation around Bastogne grew increasingly dire, Warren Creasy was becoming a legend among the soldiers of the 764th. December 22nd brought the engagement that would cement that legend forever and create a combat record that would be studied for decades to come. Warren's battalion had been pushed back steadily over the previous days, giving ground grudgingly but giving it nonetheless, and now they held a ridge overlooking a critical supply road. If enemy armor broke through here, the entire defensive line around Bastogne could collapse. The road led directly to the supply depots that kept the besieged garrison fed and armed. Lose the road, lose Bastogne. Lose Bastogne, possibly lose the entire battle. The 764th was ordered to hold at all costs, the kind of order that every soldier dreads, because it means no retreat, no withdrawal if things go badly, no escape if the position becomes untenable. Hold at all costs, die if necessary, but hold. The attack came at mid-morning. Weak winter sun trying to penetrate the perpetual cloud cover that had grounded Allied air power for days. Enemy reconnaissance had identified the ridge as the key to breaking through to Bastogne, and they committed significant forces to taking it. 12 tanks, a mixture of Panzer Mark IVs and the heavier Panther tanks with their sloped armor and powerful guns, supported by at least 2 companies of veteran infantry who knew their business. Warren's battalion had 7 functional tank destroyers after days of constant combat and losses that hadn't been replaced. They had perhaps 300 soldiers, many of them exhausted, all of them low on ammunition, some wounded but still fighting because there was nobody to replace them. The mathematics were not in their favor. The mathematics suggested that this position would fall, that the defenders would be overwhelmed through simple numerical superiority. Anderson gathered his crew before the battle, his hands steady, but his voice carrying the weight of what they all knew might be coming. The knowledge that this could be their last day. "They're going to hit us with everything they have," he said simply, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "We hold as long as we can, then we fall back on my order, not before. No heroes, no last stands, no dramatic sacrifices. We're more valuable alive and fighting another day than dead and glorious, understood?" Everyone nodded, understanding the order, appreciating Anderson's concern for their survival. Except Warren was thinking about those 6 rejections, about every recruiting sergeant who had dismissed him without a second glance, about being told repeatedly that he wasn't good enough, wasn't needed, wasn't wanted. He was thinking about his father's words that had sustained him through every rejection. You only truly lose when you let them break you, when you accept their judgment as the truth of who you are. The tanks came in 2 distinct waves, professional tactics executed by veteran crews who had fought across half of Europe. The first 6 advanced with infantry spread wide on both flanks, each vehicle covering the others, moving through the difficult terrain with practiced efficiency. These were not the inexperienced replacements that had manned some of the earlier attacks Warren had faced. These were veterans, survivors of years of combat, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The Hellcats opened fire at maximum range, nearly 1,500 yards, and 2 enemy tanks went down immediately, main guns finding their marks with precision shots that spoke to the training and skill of the American gunners. But the remaining 4 tanks kept coming, professional and determined, and now they were firing back. Rounds cracked through the cold air, impacting around Warren's position, and one Hellcat took a direct hit that penetrated its thin armor and exploded the ammunition storage. The crew lost in an instant of fire and destruction. Warren opened up with the M2, not at tanks yet, but at the advancing infantry who were trying to flank the American positions. The heavy rounds cut through the snowdrifts and the soldiers advancing through them, the sustained fire forcing them to go to ground, seeking whatever cover they could find. The infantry wave faltered, pinned down by accurate fire, unable to support their armor the way they had planned. Now the second wave of tanks appeared, 6 more armored vehicles moving to exploit what their commanders expected would be a breakthrough at any moment. But the first wave had stalled, tangled up in difficult terrain and facing more resistance than anticipated, and the second wave bunched up behind them, vehicles maneuvering through the limited space available, trying to find positions from which they could bring their guns to bear. This was the critical moment, Warren realized with sudden clarity. This was where everything hung in the balance. The enemy had committed all their armor to this assault, had concentrated their strength for a decisive blow, but in doing so they had created exactly the kind of target-rich environment where Warren's unconventional tactics could make the maximum difference. "Sir," Warren called down to Anderson, his voice calm despite his racing heartbeat. "I need you to trust me completely right now. Keep them bunched up with your fire, keep them close together. Channel them into that killing zone directly ahead." Anderson understood instantly, saw what Warren was planning, and made the tactical decision to trust his gunner's judgment over textbook doctrine. "All Hellcats, shift fire to the flanks," he ordered over the radio net. "Force them to channel center. Concentrate them." The Hellcats obeyed immediately, their main guns booming, and the enemy formation responded exactly as Anderson had predicted. Rather than spreading out under fire and presenting multiple dispersed targets, the tanks compressed together, seeking the path of least resistance through the middle of their formation, every commander independently making the same decision that created exactly the situation Warren needed. Warren had perhaps 30 seconds before enemy commanders realized what was happening and ordered their forces to disperse. He made every single second count, everything he had learned over months of combat, all the weak points he had memorized, all the practice that had made the weapon an extension of his will. All of it focused into this moment. The M2 roared to life, and Warren worked it like the precision instrument he had made it. Not random fire, not spray and pray, but careful, aimed bursts at specific points on specific tanks, track assemblies to immobilize and create obstacles, engine decks to disable and generate smoke that would blind following vehicles, vision ports to eliminate the crew's ability to see, ammunition storage points to catastrophically destroy. His first target, a Panther tank that should have been nearly immune to his weapon with its thick sloped armor, took sustained fire into its engine deck. The heavy armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the thinner top protection, dozens of them in quick succession, and suddenly thick smoke poured from the engine compartment. The tank slowed, stopped, crew beginning to bail out as fire threatened the ammunition storage. His second target lost a track to sustained fire, dozens of rounds chewing through the relatively thin metal until the track separated completely and the tank slewed sideways, its bulk now blocking the tank immediately behind it. His third target took precision fire through a ventilation grill on its side, a weak point he had identified in his studies, but never had the perfect angle to exploit until this moment, and flames erupted from its interior as something vital was struck. The heavy machine gun grew dangerously hot, the barrel glowing faintly even in daylight, but Warren couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, had to maintain the pressure. He changed barrels with practiced speed, hands moving automatically through the sequence he had practiced hundreds of times, muscle memory taking over so that conscious thought could focus entirely on target selection and engagement. Fresh barrel locked into place and the weapon roared again, the sustained fire creating a sound that echoed across the battlefield like rolling thunder. Fourth tank, fifth tank, sixth tank, each one disabled or destroyed through precision fire at weak points, through understanding that armor was only as strong as its thinnest section, through the countless hours of training that had taught Warren exactly where those sections were and how to exploit them. The enemy formation, which should have swept over the American position through sheer weight of numbers, instead began to disintegrate. The surviving tanks, those that could still move under their own power, began to withdraw in disorder. Their infantry support, caught in the open when their armor retreated and with no protection from the devastating fire coming from the ridge, either surrendered or fled back toward their own lines. The ridge, which conventional military analysis suggested should have fallen within an hour, held firm. When the firing finally stopped and silence descended over the battlefield, broken only by the sound of burning vehicles and the moans of wounded, Warren's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold on to the gun. His shoulders were one massive bruise from hours of recoil pounding into them. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that would last for days. Blood seeped from his nose from the sustained concussive force. But when he looked out at the field below the ridge, he counted 12 enemy tanks disabled or destroyed, their burned-out hulks marking the high-water mark of the German offensive in this sector. He had personally accounted for 9 of them with the M2 heavy machine gun. 9 tanks destroyed or disabled with a weapon that wasn't designed to kill armor, that every tactical manual said couldn't kill armor, that conventional wisdom insisted was utterly ineffective against armored targets. 9 impossible victories through skill, determination, an intimate understanding of his weapon's capabilities, and the absolute refusal to accept that something was impossible just because everyone said so. Anderson climbed up to Warren's position, his face pale with a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and something approaching awe. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette, the small human gesture of someone who had just survived something that should have killed them all. "Cressy," Anderson said, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words adequate to what he had just witnessed. That was the single most incredible display of marksmanship I've ever seen in my life. You just held this entire ridge, saved this entire battalion, possibly saved the entire defensive line around Bastogne, almost single-handedly. Warren finally released his death grip on the gun, flexing his cramped fingers, feeling every bruise and strain and ache in his body. "We held it together, sir. Everyone played their part. The other Hellcats, the infantry, everyone." "Don't give me that modest routine," Anderson replied. And there was something in his voice beyond simple respect, something like wonder. "I watched what you did. I'm putting you in for every commendation I can justify. What you accomplished today, it saved this entire battalion and everyone depending on us. That's not hyperbole, that's simple fact. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.